From the Skyterra Wellness Retreat, this is the Inspired Intentions podcast, where we help people build the skills and mindset to live a healthy life. Hey everyone, before we dive into today's episode, if you've been enjoying our podcast, take a moment to rate and review. It may seem like a small thing, but our ratings and reviews make a huge difference in the quality of our show. They help us reach more listeners like you so we can continue bringing you more amazing content. So, if you've found inspiration, learned something new, or just love tuning in every week, please rate the Inspired Intentions podcast 5 stars and leave us a review and even share with a friend. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. Now let's get into the show.
Hello, Inspired Intentions listeners. So, as you might imagine in the booth before we start recording, Alan has what I like to call a spiel, and I got to the point where I could almost say it along with him. It's just the directions that he gives to me and to our guest when he's not on the mic or when he is on the mic. And he loves to talk about our unidirectional microphones and how you need to speak directly into them to make sure that the sound is consistent, etc. Well, today's guest, which Alan didn't know, today's guest is a musician, more specifically a singer. So as he was starting to explain to her how the microphones work, she's like, I got it. So I am pleased and really honored to welcome Julia Ruff to the show. Hi, Julia.
Hi.
Hi. And we are not talking about music today, but I just think you have a beautiful voice. And so I'm excited for our listeners to hear from you on your expertise as well, of course.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being on the show.
Happy to be here.
Oh, good. And then, Julia, before we get into anything, I would love if you could just introduce yourself to our listeners, only because you have not been on our show before.
Absolutely. Yes, so I am a primary therapist up at Skyterra Young Adult. I have been working with young people in many capacities for many years. So for the last 7 years, I have worked in residential crisis intervention. Before that, I was a Waldorf kindergarten teacher, lots of summer camps, nonprofits, also worked in a homeless shelter, leading mindfulness classes and parent skills workshops.
And Julia, so listeners, I realize that you cannot see in our booth right now, but Julia has beautiful hair color, and I would really just like to describe it if it's okay, Julia. So I think right at the top of Julia's head is orange, and then it fades into this beautiful deep red, and then purple, and then I think some blue, and then green, and then on the tips right at the end she has yellow. And I know you're really intentional about your hair color. Would you mind, just because our listeners can't see you, just describing why you dye your hair in that really specific way?
Yeah. I bring a lot of art and music and creative self-expression into the work that I do in general. I really want to motivate in young people that positive identity development. And so that's one part of it. The other big part of my hair color is that a lot of the young adults that we work with have a really negative view of therapy in general and haven't had really positive experiences yet. And so I really like having the opportunity to have them reshape that idea of what therapy can be like and kind of lower those defenses. And my hope is always that after they leave Skyterra, there's still an interest in therapy so they can keep getting that support.
Have any of the people that you've worked with ever said to you, I felt just more willing to talk to you or open up to you just based on your appearance? Just curious.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would say especially young people. There's this, oh, you're cool, you get it, and we can talk about music and we can be humorous together, and that helps them start to talk about those harder things that they weren't really opening up about before.
Break down their defenses. Yeah. Well, listeners, we have certainly talked about Skyterra Young Adult before, and of course, Julia does work at our Young Adult campus. And if you're new to Skyterra or if you're new to this show, let me just describe the difference and the similarities between our two campuses. So Skyterra Wellness Retreat, of course, we have our 5 pillars of wellness, and that is primarily for adults looking for a healthy reset, a healthy vacation. About 2.5 years ago, we opened up a separate campus called Skyterra Young Adult. It is about 20 minutes away. Smaller campus. It takes the same pillars of wellness and then adds therapeutic layer on top of it. So one-on-one therapy sessions with Julia and our other therapists, as well as group processing. And that program really just works to help younger adults 18 to 29 get the skills to be able to live their lives in a healthy way and launch into adulthood in a really purposeful and healthy way. So today's episode, yes, of course, Julia's experiences in working with young adults, but I promise you this is fascinating. And no matter your age, you will learn something, and you'll learn something about your brain. So, Julia, let's introduce the topic for our listeners. When we were trying to figure out what to do this show about, you and I started brainstorming, and you have a really experienced and knowledgeable understanding of how people's brains work. And I think originally we were going to do one topic, and then just listening to you talk, we decided let's just tell people how to hack their brains, understand what's going on in your brain, how it works, and you're going to help us do that.
Absolutely. Yeah, we all have brains.
Yes.
It's true.
Yeah. So I think the first question I have for you is really, in your experience, do people understand how their brains work?
Well, I would say the more that I've learned about brains, the more I realize how little people know about their brains. I often joke that it's job security, that folks don't really understand that piece. I think especially around how our brains affect our communication, our interpersonal relationships, our emotion regulation. The big thing that drew me to being a therapist in the first place was seeing conflict between the students I had when I was a Waldorf kindergarten teacher, seeing them arguing together, feeling excluded, crying, and noticing that understanding our nervous systems more and our brains more can help us in those moments where we're in conflict with other people or in conflict with ourselves.
Which I'm sure you see a lot of, especially with, I'm imagining, younger adults.
Absolutely. Yes, a lot of the folks that we work with are struggling to talk about how they feel. They really act out how they feel, either acting outwards, acting inwards. And really, we're helping them build that vocabulary about those feelings and learning where those feelings come from, what part of our pasts and our brains as well, how our brains help us regulate in those moments that we may be upset.
And we'll definitely dive into all of that. But I think my bigger question for you is, when you first start to meet with a guest at our young adult campus, do they have any kind of specific diagnosis, or are they kind of learning about themselves for the very first time?
I would say a lot of the guests coming in the door have misdiagnoses. And so they think they have bigger things like oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder. And often within a few days of knowing these individuals, I recognize that these are not what we're looking at here. A lot of times it's more trauma-based, or it's based in recent life circumstances, so more circumstantial than what's genetic or something like that.
Sure. And I imagine there may be some relief in the folks that you're working with once they find out, actually, this isn't something that I have no control over. This is something that I've been through. And to use your words, maybe I just need help communicating and regulating my emotions.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would say connection is the opposite of addiction, and addiction doesn't have to be substances. It can be staying in our bed all day, or not wanting to go to the gym, or not eating well, not drinking enough water. And so having that connection, understanding our brains is essential to really getting that connection in a healthy, intentional way.
So where do we start? I mean, I definitely want to learn how our brains work, but I think for everybody listening, myself included, figuring out, how to just kind of hack through what you just said and understand, okay, how do I connect trauma to what I'm doing today? How do I connect things that have happened in my past to the ways that I'm feeling today and communicating with people and interacting with others?
I think a great place to start is in individual therapy and exploring what are the things in our lives that aren't going well or not going the way that we would like, and really solidifying the goals that you have and what you'd like to change. And I'd say with that, then we can dive into what parts of your nervous system may be contributing.
Can you give us a for instance?
Yeah, I would say I spoke to a lot of those misdiagnoses before, and what we often see is that it's more either trauma-based, like I said, or neurodivergence. And so that can be ADHD, that can be autism spectrum. And as we learn more about that, that can inform why we work the way we do. I often, with the guests that are coming in with those misdiagnoses, there is that sense of relief around, oh gosh, this is why I do that. And it's not my fault. I don't have to carry all this shame that I didn't do well in that job, or that person got mad at me and we broke up, or I didn't get a good grade on that test. When we understand our brains more, it's, hey, this is the way we are. It's not because we're lazy or bad.
So what are some ways that you start to help folks just understand how their brains work? What kind of learning and education do you do for them?
Well, I would say with all the skills that we work on at Skyterra, we really want to have practice. And so we may introduce the topic, and we're going to come back to it because we definitely need repetition to learn anything. Often I say that FAIL stands for first attempt in learning.
I love
So
that.
you may learn about the brain on this podcast, and to remember it, you got to go back to it. You got to
Yes.
keep returning to the information, watching YouTube videos, practicing what you're learning so that you actually learn it. So to teach guests about their brain, this is usually an 8-week process, a longer process where there's lots of repetition, lots of practice.
And what does that practice look like? So I hope this is okay to say, I was in a meeting yesterday with some of your team, and we talked about popping thought bubbles. What is that?
That is my colleague Ryan's expertise. It's a mindfulness skill, I'd say sort of mixed with some CBT, which is
CBT?
cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's a method in which if you're having a thought that you don't like, that's making you feel bad, different forms of therapy call it different things, either an unhelpful thought, a cognitive distortion, or an irrational belief. So these are all different names for the same thing. And if one of these is coming up, like a self-defeating thought, something like that, then you imagine the thought as if it was in a bubble, and you pop the bubble physically in your brain. You just imagine the bubble popping, and then you replace it with an alternative belief. And so we work on that in session around, okay, how is this belief serving you or not serving you, and what would you like it to be instead? So you can practice in the moments that it comes up. Let's replace it with something else.
That's got to be really helpful for people, I would imagine.
With some people, it depends. With all the skills that we learn, we often teach 10 or 15, and we hope that you get 3 out of it, really 3 or 4, because different folks, at the end of this podcast, we're going to do a breathing exercise. Spoiler alert there. Some folks do not like breathing exercises. They make them feel more nervous. But other folks really dislike progressive muscle relaxation. So there's different things that work for different people. So I encourage everyone listening to check out the different grounding skills and mindfulness skills and see what works best for them.
So popping that thought bubble and then replacing the thought would be something that you may practice over those 8 weeks while you're trying to learn a new skill. Are there others that seem to, I know everybody's different, but are there others that seem to resonate really well with the guests that you work with?
Yes. Yeah, I would say the first way we teach about the brain is we go through all the different parts, which we'll do here in a moment. And once they understand that information, then we apply it in real time to their relationships with other people. So the biggest skills that we practice are communication skills. Once we understand our brain, knowing when is it time to take what we call a personal reflection time and take space because we're activated, and when is it time to engage, in what way can we engage in a productive way.
Let's learn about the brain.
Yes. So I love to use Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain. It is very, very easy to teach even 5-year-olds. And so I encourage everyone to look at a picture of the hand model of the brain. And if not, we can figure it out together. So you make a fist, and you want to make sure that your thumb is on the inside of your fist. So making a gentle fist, you want to look at the wrist first, and the wrist is your hind brain. So that's your brain stem. We also call that the lizard brain. It is involved in involuntary bodily functions like heart rate, breathing, sweating. And then there's the limbic system. If you're looking at the palm and the back of your hand, the main part of your hand, that is the very, very top of your head, the emotional part of the brain. So that's where we process emotions, and also the hippocampus is there. Hippocampus is encoding memories. And so in that part of the brain, as you can imagine, if that's where your senses are, all your five senses, your memory, and your emotional center, that is why memories are so emotional so often, really tied to emotions and senses. If you think about a smell or a taste bringing back a memory, those are all in the same part of the brain. So then if you look at the fingers in the front, this is more the primate part of the brain. And this is the prefrontal cortex, which is not fully developed till you're 25 or 26 years old. And this is the part of the brain that's in charge of executive functioning, which is planning, organization, scheduling, and a big piece is thinking about long-term consequences, which is why young adults that aren't 26 yet can really struggle to think about, if I do this, then what will happen, right? And then what? So the prefrontal cortex, really important in relationships, as you can imagine, if you're able to use what we call your thinking brain versus your emotional brain. So when we get activated by something, this could either be, oh my gosh, we almost got in a car wreck, or we skipped a stair on the steps, or we thought it was a snake, but it's just a stick. Those moments of, oh my goodness, whew, that was a close one. That's when our amygdala will be triggered. So the amygdala, if you bring up your fingers to see that thumb underneath, that's the amygdala. And your amygdala is the smoke detector of the brain. And so that is the part of your brain, mayday, mayday, there's something wrong. We need to do something to stay safe here. So it's made for the saber-toothed tigers of the world, the bears, which we have here, but they're very gentle. They never come to our campus, really. They care more about the city. They like the trash. But things like bears, things like big predators is where this came from. And now, as modern-day humans, an angry post from somebody on Facebook can trigger it. An argument can trigger it. Anything where we feel like that pack mentality is being threatened, our amygdala responds as, oh my gosh, we're going to be left by the pack. We're going to be out in the woods and cold and not have any food to eat. So that amygdala being triggered, it's good to learn what triggers your amygdala. And so as you can see or hear about as you're doing it yourself, when you move those fingers up to expose the amygdala and see your thumb there, that means you've flipped your lid. You have made it so your prefrontal cortex has gone offline because your blood and resources in your brain are going to that amygdala to put you into fight or flight mode. And so a lot of what we're learning with the guests is, what does your fight or flight look like when you go into that place we call hyperarousal, when your amygdala is triggered? How do you show up around that? Do you run away? Do you yell? Do you slam a door? It depends on the person. And so fight or flight there. And fawn and freeze are different because we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system. Fawn and freeze are more the hypoarousal. That's your vagus nerve. So some people respond in moments of danger in this shut down, fear-based, which we can imagine. If we saw a bear, we might do that too. Of like, I'm just not going to run. I'm not going to move. So depending. But when the lid is flipped, this is more of the sympathetic nervous system, the hyperarousal, the fight or flight. And so to get that lid back engaged, we want to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest part of the brain. And Rachel, can you guess one of the best ways for us to get back regulated if we're really dysregulated and really upset?
Breathing.
Everyone gets it right. Everyone knows. Everyone knows that breathing works. It's true. And namely, a longer exhale than your inhale. Those examples I gave before. If you miss a stair on the steps, the first thing you probably do, gosh. Or you see a stick and you think it's a snake and then you realize it's not. Oh my gosh, that was close. So already our body is wired to help regulate us in that way. And we can take that knowledge and use it even more with that longer exhale.
That is fascinating. And I don't even know that I've ever heard that before, but just watching you, listeners, I would encourage you to follow along with Julia and do the hand motion that she did, because that was really interesting to see, especially the flip your lid part.
Mm-hmm.
So once the guests that you work with understand how their brains work, kind of what happens when they get triggered, how do you work with them on, okay, so you've been triggered, exhale longer than you inhale, and then what?
So we teach some classes. One of the classes is dialectical behavioral therapy, mainly focused on distress tolerance. There's another class that is about emotion regulation that uses the community resiliency model. And so DBT and CRM, those two acronyms I just spoke out there, they have lots of different science-based, brain-based interventions like the deep breathing that you can do with yourself to re-regulate. And so we teach those in classes. And then in community, we practice, hey, if we're a yeller, what's the next step we can do? If we can't take a deep breath in the moment, we take some space. So we take a walk and say, hey, I'm not in a space to have this conversation right now. I'll be back. And we really encourage those intentional breaks to regulate as well. And we call that personal reflection time, PRT. And sometimes we also call that pause, reflect, try again. And that try again is very important, right? Because some people, I'm taking space from this situation, they don't come back. They don't come back and re-engage. They avoid, and then we'll pretend the conflict doesn't exist. So we really want to include the try again, even if we take that space that we need.
And how does trauma affect all of that?
Great question. I would say that it makes that amygdala response more responsive. And so sometimes it will respond in moments that are not dangerous, that the brain is perceiving as danger. And so that dysregulation will happen even if we're safe.
And for guests who have experienced trauma, and I would argue that we probably all have at varying scales.
Same.
Yes. How, more trauma, less trauma, does it have any impact on the type of strategies that you're using or how long it takes you to implement these into your life?
Yeah, I would say all of the work that we do at Skyterra on both campuses is trauma-informed. When it comes to yoga, our instructors are saying, hey, if you feel comfortable, close your eyes. If not, pick a spot on the ceiling, pick a spot on the ground. If you don't feel safe enough to close your eyes right now, valid. And we can support that. And so we definitely want to be trauma-informed in all of the work we do because I agree with you. All of the guests we work with have experienced trauma.
At both campuses.
Yes, both campuses. And a lot of the work we do really hits into that. If you read The Body Keeps the Score, that's a great resource that explains how yoga and group singing and group dancing, group movement really help rewire the brain and create that felt sense of safety and helps the amygdala be less reactive.
From a community-based perspective?
Yeah, being in a group of people, it's creating that sense of, oh, I can trust my environment. I can trust the people around me. And with yoga especially, it's also I can trust myself.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it in this way, but something that we're really intentional about at Skyterra, both campuses, is this sense of community. And we work to build that for our Skyterra guests from day one. We've talked about it on this podcast many times, but it's how we set up our meals. It's the fact that we have a community campfire. Because a lot of guests who come to both campuses come alone. And traveling by yourself is hard. It's hard to do, especially if it's your first time. And we know how important community can be. And I just never thought about it in the context of healing from trauma as well. Just the power of that community. That's beautiful.
Absolutely. Yeah. On a physiological level, you can look at brain scans after experiencing that community, and the amygdala, it actually can grow, and you can see it shrinking a little bit when you get that support.
I remember too, after COVID, just reading some articles about how what had been lost during the COVID was power of shared experience. And the article was more about theater performances and sports performances, but being in a room with people, and Alan and I have talked about this too on our Mental Health Benefits of Sports podcast, which is being in a room with people or in a stadium with people and experiencing that joy, the highs and the lows is just such a bonding experience. And that was lost for a couple of years.
Yeah, it was.
And I would imagine, too, with the younger guests that you worked with, they probably experienced the loss of that community aspect during really formative years.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is central to a lot of the identity development work. A lot of the guests that we work with really rely on technology for them to get those needs met, connection and belonging. That's like oxygen. We all need the connection and belonging in our lives. And with COVID, a lot of them turned to that online world and are still struggling to come out of that, playing video games, being on social media. And so we really encourage them to get into the community and practice what we call age-appropriate social risks, where we don't want to just be in our bedroom all the time behind a screen. You got to go out there in the world in an age-appropriate way. We're now adults. It's time for us to advocate for ourselves and experience some direct communication, giving and receiving feedback. These are things that we all need to learn how to do.
And you cannot do that through a screen, I'm guessing.
You can, and our brains have mirror neurons and oxytocin and all sorts of things that only work when we're face-to-face, or at least work a lot better face-to-face.
Sure.
And luckily, since the community is a bunch of folks that are dealing with this, you're not the odd person out if that's what you're facing. There's a lot of other people on the same page really nervous to come to those community meals at first of who are all these people and I don't know if they're going to like me. And we want to build that self-efficacy of, oh, I can walk into a room, I can do this, and that self-confidence and self-esteem as well.
And speaking of that, Julia, one of the things that I think is so beautiful about the way your team especially works with our guests is that supportive environment that exists. Talk to me about support and non-judgment and how intentional your whole team is about setting up that environment.
Yeah. There's a few things that I hear a lot of guests say that warm my heart and give my job lots of meaning and is a big reason I'm so passionate about the work. And one of those things that we hear so often is guests say, this is the kindest community I've ever been a part of. Like, I've never had people be so nice to me before. And there can be some sadness when leaving around, in the real world, people aren't just so willing to hear about my feelings and support me and show up for me in the same way.
Yeah.
And so it is an extremely supportive environment where folks can feel they can be themselves authentically, and we're not going to criticize or judge. We will bring up concerns around, hey, that joke wasn't really funny. Let's talk about that. Or, hey, you keep interrupting that person. Let's check in about what's going on here. We'll definitely have that authenticity, I would say. So it's not this, oh, kumbaya, everything's great, we all love each other. And there's so much support there for folks to be able to heal and grow.
Yeah. And then as far as that support goes, all guests get an hour of individual therapy every week and an hour with family. And family therapy. We've talked before on this podcast about how you need your time in therapy and then you need time to process all of the work that you've done in that hour. And I don't want to speak for you, but I believe has been set up in a really intentional way.
Yes. Yeah, throughout the week, part of how we process what we're learning in individual and family therapy is we have 4 to 5 hours of group therapy as well. And so myself and my colleague Ryan Bell, we spearhead that. We are very different folks and we have different strengths. And so we make a strong team where I might want to lead an art activity or a group singing activity, and Ryan might want to do a waterfall hike or do some mindfulness in the yoga yurt. And so we do different things, and a lot of how we show up in the community is follow through with assignments to help us process what we're learning. So lots of writing assignments, journaling, building that self-exploration and self-awareness, and also really targeting family work as well. We really encourage letter writing back and forth, which is really structured so we can get deeper, do some of that more vulnerable relationship repair.
And so these young adults are learning really specific skills. They're learning conflict resolution, breath work.
Absolutely.
Anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I would say what we see most often is that the guest on our campus becomes the expert in the family on these skills because they're practicing. They're practicing throughout the day. And so a lot of the work is teaching the people in their lives when they get home. So it is a lot of these communication skills, these I feel statements, conflict resolution, and also listening skills. A lot of folks actually aren't listening. They're thinking about what they're going to say next. And so that's a big one that we teach as well. But when it comes to that emotion regulation, I'd say hand in hand with the communication skills for us to be able to effectively communicate and have that lid online, that prefrontal cortex. We have to make sure we're doing the breathing and we're really focusing on getting our parasympathetic nervous system back online, the rest and digest.
I would imagine too, if you're a young adult who's learning, I mean, just in the amount of information that you've provided today, Julia, it's just a ton of information, learning how everything works, practicing using those skills. I would imagine if you go back into a family that may or may not be in conflict, I think probably every family has conflict, but that's got to kind of tip, not necessarily the balance, but maybe tip everything on its side in terms of how communication is happening and maybe also how things are getting resolved. Is that what you see typically?
Yes. So we take a family systems approach. And when you think of a system, it's self-maintained. And you can think about your own relationship with your mom or your dad or your child or your friend. If you've known someone for long enough, you get into a routine and you kind of stay there, which can be surprising when you're an older adult and, oh my gosh, we're going right back to that again.
Mm-hmm.
And when one part of the system changes, by default, the rest of the system gets all discombobulated. And wait, well, you don't talk to me that way. What do you mean? You're setting a boundary? Right? We teach people how to treat us. And so when we say, oh, no, that's not okay with me anymore, then there's a recalibration. And so absolutely, once one part of the system changes, we see a lot of folks follow suit with that ripple effect.
Do you notice any other changes in guests after they've learned about everything and have been practicing the skills, especially at the end of their stay at young adult?
Mm-hmm. A lot of times in the beginning of their stay, there's this external locus of control, which is, I don't think I have control over my own life. Other people do.
Mm-hmm.
That teacher gave me a bad grade on purpose. My mom didn't give me money for this. Whatever it is, there's this blame of everybody else. And really struggling to see how I, myself, am contributing to my own life. And so we really focus, when it comes to acceptance and commitment therapy, our lens is about what are our values and how do we show our values to the world in what we talk about and what we walk about, our walk and our talk. And so many guests have no idea what their values are until we do that exploration work. And so going from that place of an external locus of control, blaming other people, we go into that internal locus of control of, oh, I'm in charge of some of the bad parts of my life, and I'm in charge of some of the good parts too. What are the things I can do in my life? If I have anxiety, how can I have control over that anxiety instead of it having control over me? So building that self-efficacy and that belief. The second thing that I love hearing from guests, other than I love this community, the other one is, oh, wow, I can do more than I thought I could, which...
That's amazing.
Take that with you because it's true.
Yeah.
It's true in so many capacities. You can cook better than you thought you could. You can go to the gym more than you thought you could. You can have yoga in your life more than you realize. There's so many things that we don't believe we're capable of. And that's the biggest change we see is more belief in themselves.
That's beautiful. So Julia, of course, is one of a few of our very skilled therapists that we have here at Skyterra. And listeners, we like to always end our show with giving you an actionable tip that you can do today. First, if you want more information about Skyterra Young Adult, skyterraya.com. If you want some videos, exercise videos, lecture handouts, you can always go to skyterraathome.com. And of course, skyterrawellness.com is our wellness retreat website. So lots of information there. But Julia teased for us a breathing exercise. So I am going to, let's close with your breathing exercise. I'm really interested in this. I'm just going to turn the mic over to you.
Mm-hmm. So a really great app on your phone that has exercises like this is called iChill. And iChill is using that community resiliency model that I spoke to before, the CRM model, with many different emotion regulation skills on there. They have 5 different categories. So the one we're going to practice today is one called square breathing. And so with square breathing, you can get out your little pointer finger and draw a square as we're doing these breaths. And as you're drawing the first line, that is you inhaling. And the other lines, the second line is you holding. Third line is exhaling. Fourth line is holding. So we're going to go through that. Again, reminder, it's inhale, hold, exhale, hold for that. So for the first side, we're going to inhale for about 4 seconds. So inhale, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4. Hold empty, 3, 4. Inhale again, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4. Hold empty, 2, 3, 4. And if you want, you can increase that to 5 or 6 seconds as you're able. As you practice, you can make it longer. And the longer it is, the more effective it is within reason. We don't want to be holding it for too long. But I'd say 8 seconds or so is a good ideal to aim for.
Thank you so much, Julia. And thank you for all of the information that you provided today. We'll definitely have you back on the podcast if you agree.
Yeah, I look forward to it.
Thanks again, listeners. Bye.
Bye.
The Inspired Intentions podcast is a production of Skyterra Wellness Retreat. Special thanks to our executive producer, Alan Broyhill. Send us your questions and comments to inspiredintentions@skyterrawellness.com. Subscribe on iTunes and everywhere podcasts can be found. If someone you know might benefit from this podcast, share Inspired Intentions with them and give us a 5-star rating. Join us next week as we cut through the unrealistic noise on diets and fitness and show you how healthy living fits seamlessly into your already busy life. Thanks for listening.